and welcome. In this lecture, we'll learn about the read FWF method. We'll see how we can use this method to grab information related to dates and times. And once we use this method to grab the information, we'll manipulate the data so that it can be presented to a format where we can, for instance, index it and then use it for other purposes also. Okay, let's first start by looking at the read FWF method. So if you go to the pandas documentation, similar to the read CSV and all the other read methods, there's also a method known as read underscore FWF. It stands for fixed width format, and we use this method to read a table of fixed width formatted lines into a data frame. Okay, and it accepts lots of parameters. So once we call the read FWF method, we provide our file path or URL, and then there are other attributes that we can pass: call specs, width, and here are some more attributes that this method takes. Call specs, width, delimiter. So there's a lot of attributes that it accepts. Okay, for our purpose, we'll be looking at a few attributes known as parse dates and infer date time format. So parse dates is here, and for this attribute we can pass a list of integers or names, for instance 1 to 3. So we'll pass a list of integers, and the other attribute we'll use is infer date time format. It takes a boolean value of true or false. Okay, let's go back and consider this URL. So I have this URL open here. So it contains data for year, month, and information value. Okay, here it starts from 1950. This is the month, so first month or January, and then you have February, March, all the way up to December, and then it goes to 1951. You have the months, 12 months, and then it goes to 1952. And you have the values here. Okay, monthly index. And this goes all the way to 2016. So what we'll do is use the fixed width format method, the read FWF method, to load our data first. Let's do that. Before we do that, let's import pandas as pd, and let's import numpy as np. What we'll do next is call the read FWF method. So pd.read underscore FWF, and then we'll pass this URL. So let's do that. So it ends here, and let's pass some of those attributes. Let me go to a new line, and we'll pass some of those attributes that we saw. So parse underscore dates is one attribute. We'll pass that, and we saw that we could pass a list of integers, right? So let's pass 0 and 1. For header, we'll pass none. And the other attribute we can pass is called the infer date time format. Infer date time format. And let's set this to be equal to true, since it takes a boolean value. And we'll save this in a variable called data FWF for fixed width format. Now let's call our data FWF, and then we'll call the head method and see what our data looks like. Okay, here we have 0, 1, and 2. We know that this is our month and year, and that's the value. So what we can do is we can add columns to our data frame. So this doesn't make sense for us, right? 0, 1, 2, it doesn't make sense for us. Let's add column for our data. So we can say data FWF, we'll call the columns method on it, and let's add our columns data. Let's say months column value for our column. So those will be columns for our data. Let's see what it looks like now. So if I call data FWF, okay, now we have our months column and then associated value, right? We have two columns, months and value. The next thing we can do is we can use the months as an index, right? So let me make this head. Okay, so let's use let me go back here. So what we can do is we can use the months as our index, right? So for that, let's call the index method on our data FWF data frame. So we can call the index method and then simply pass our data's months. So data FWF dot months. This data frame object has no attribute months. So months underscore column. That's the name we gave it, right? Let's run it again. Now let's see our data frame, data FWF. Okay, it's looking much better, right? So we have 1950, 0101. We have our months column. We have associated value. It's looking better now. So we have two columns, the months column and the value column. And for our index, we have the months. We just called it months call. And here you see the index and the value in the months column are the same. So what we can do is, since we want the date here as our index, we can simply drop this column, right? The months column. We don't need this anymore. We just want to use this months, year and day as our index. So if I go to the URL here, I just want to use this for as an index, and this will be the associated value. Okay, so in order to drop that, we can simply call the drop method on our data FWF data frame and simply pass the name of the column I want to drop, which is months call in this case, right? Let's do that. So data underscore FWF dot drop, and then I'll pass the name of the column I want to drop, which is months call. Then I'll pass 1, since we'll be dropping this column, and I will save this. I'll reassign it to the same variable. Let's run this. Now if we call our data FWF data frame and then call the head method, we see that we have the months as our index and associated value for our value. Now it looks really good for our purpose, right? We can easily work with this data set. So that's how we can use the read FWF method. Okay, once we load our data, we might need to manipulate the data so that it serves our purpose. And some of the arguments are the parse dates, infer date time, header, index columns, and there is so much more of those attributes. You can read more about that. One other thing I want to show you is that here we just considered this specific format to load our data, right? You can change the value of one or more of these attributes to a different format. For instance, if you change this infer date time format to false, for instance, and see which one will load the data the fastest, you can use the Timeit module to see which method or which format will give you, which best combination will give you the fastest load time. Let me show you an example. So we'll need to import the Timeit module, and what we can do is, so that's what we saw previously, right? And what we can do is we have a special Timeit method or function, right? So in this case, we used the infer datetime format as true, and let's print a statement. We can say the time it takes to load our data set when infer datetime format is true, right? So let's copy that, paste it here. So the time it takes our data to load when infer datetime format is equal to true, right? And that will give us the time. And next, what we can do is, let's copy this whole thing, paste it here, and this time we'll set the infer datetime format to false. Okay, and let's simply print, I'll copy this whole statement, Command C, Command V, and then I'll say the time it takes to load our data set when infer datetime format is false. Now let's run these two cells and see how long it takes. Oh, I have an extra quotation there. Let me remove that too. Let me run it again. Okay, so the time it takes to load our dataset when infer datetime format is true. So tail loops best of 3, it took 66.3 milliseconds per loop. How about the second case? Let's run it. Okay, second time for the second combination we have 66.4 milliseconds per loop. So here it takes about the same amount of time, right? And other things you can do is you can change the number of loops to a higher loop and see how it's affected. Or other things that we can do is we can pass another attribute known as the date parse, the date parser attribute, right? And once we pass the date parser attribute, we can see which combination is the fastest. So in this case, we only took the infer datetime format attribute and we just set it to either true or false. What if we pass a second attribute? What if we pass the date parser attribute? So we can check out those combinations and see which method or which combination gives us the fastest load of our data. Okay, so those are some combinations that you can do, especially if you are dealing with a larger data set. In this case, the data set might not be that large, but what if you are dealing with thousands or tens of thousands of data sets? You will want to use the best combination so that your data set loads the fastest, right? Okay, now that we have our data, let's do some analysis. So if you recall, we have our data FWF, and if we call the head method, and let's pass 15 so that we can see 15 rows. So for our index, we have January 1st, 1950, and then 1951, and so on. And you can call the tail method to see. If we call the tail method, we see that the last month is November 1st, 2016. So you can call the head and tail method to see the time span of your data set. Another way is you can call the minimum and maximum methods on your data indexes, right? So you have your data FWF data frame, and then we can call the index method, right? This will give you the index, and you can simply use the minimum method. So the minimum of your index is this timestamp, January 1st, 1950. It makes sense. That's what we have. And similarly, you can call the maximum method on your data set, on your data frame. And we have November 1st, 2016. So we can use those methods to see or have a general idea of your time span. And you can find out the type of your index by using the type function. So we can say type, we have our data frame, then we'll call the index method. You see that it's a date time index. And we can use index slicing to slice just a certain section of our data set or data frame, right? For instance, if we want to index, let's say the first 10 or the first 15 of our index, we can simply call our data frame and then pass the dates that we want to index. For instance, if I want to index from, let's say, September 1st, 2015, let's change this to 2016, and let's change the months to, let's say, 10/1/2016. We can do that. If we run this, now we have another data frame, another data set with the indexed values only, right? So we have September 1st, 2015 as our first index, and then to 2016's October 1st, right? And we can save this in another variable, let's say new data frame, and then we can do operations on this new data frame by once we indexed it. You can also call methods like toPeriod method on your data frame. Let's look at an example. So data FWF, and let's call the toPeriod method on it, and let's save this in a variable called data period. Now if you call your data period object, we have, okay, let's call the tail method or the head method. Let's just pass 10. Now we have a new data frame, right? This time we don't have the date, we only have the months and year, right? So January 1950, and then we have February 1950. So this is if we want to index our dataset by using period only, right? Instead of, so we used the toPeriod method if we want to index our data by period only. So these are some of the methods that you can call on your dataset. Another method that you can use is known as the truncate method. So truncate, and you can remove some values from your dataset by calling this truncate method. Let's say an example. Let's say we have our data FWF, right? And let's call the truncate method on it. So that truncate, and this truncate takes attributes called before and after. Let's use those attributes. Let's pass before first. Let's say we want to truncate our dataset before. Let's say you want to see your data frame for only, let's call our data FWF head method, and let's pass 15 for instance. Let's say I want to see the data starting March 1st, 1950. What we can do is we can use the truncate method to delete all the data before March 1st, 1950. We can do that. And now if we save this in the same variable called data underscore FWF and run this, now if I call data FWF, our data frame will start from March 1st, 1950, since we have removed the first two rows by this truncate method. Let me run it and show you. See, now it starts from March 1st, 1950. Okay, that's the before attribute. The second attribute is known as the after attribute. Similarly, let me call the tail method and see the end of our data frame. And let's say I'm only interested in the dataset up to the end of 2015. So if I don't want to deal with data in 2016, we can pass the after attribute. And so here we can pass, let me write it down, data FWF is equal to data FWF dot truncate after, and then we'll pass 2015 December 1st. So remove the data after December 1st, 2015. Okay. Now if I call the tail method, this will be the last of my rows. Okay. Now I have December 1st, 2015 as the last row in my dataset. Okay. So these are some of the methods that we can use. Just to recap what we have seen in this lecture, we started by looking at the read FWF method, and we saw that we can pass certain attributes to load our data. And once we load our data set, we can make it workable by adding column names and index. And once we have that, we saw that we could use the Timeit method to see which combination of attributes gives us the fastest loading time. And similar to what we have seen before, we can use indexing and work with our data. We saw methods to see the time span of our dataset. And finally, we looked at the truncate method. For instance, if you are interested in data for the year of, let's say, 2014 only, we can pass the truncate method on our data set or data frame, and then use and pass the before and after attribute